the GSE Brown Bag series. Today we are joined by Dr. Vikki Katz, assistant professor from right down the wall, Rutgers School of Communication, and Dr. Ariana Mangual Figueroa, assistant professor from right here, the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. We will be joining Katz and Mangual Figueroa this afternoon for an intellectual conversation between their respective research projects on immigrant families. We will be concluding the Brown Bag at exactly 12:45 with a moment for questions and answers. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Katz and Dr. Mangual Figueroa.
Thank you. So thanks for having us. It's wonderful to be here and to be in conversation with my good colleague, Vikki Katz. I thought I would just say one brief word about how we are situated within the Brown Bag series and tell you a little bit about the format for our conversation. So as you know from attending the series, there are sort of three strands, right? Assessment and measurement, educational policy, and learning sciences, and actually a fourth strand, learning, teaching, and development. So we see ourselves within the educational policy strand broadly defined, and what we'll be talking about is research that we've conducted in immigrant communities focusing on the role of children in immigrant families and in society, and thinking about the intersections between policy and practice in everyday life. So we're excited to sort of bring that perspective and to really center the role of children and families in this broader discussion around immigration, education, and policy in the U.S. So what we'll do is we'll have a conversation. We'll first talk individually for 5 minutes each about our work, to give you a sense of who we are and what we work on. And then we'll have about a 35-minute conversation where we'll focus on 5 points. The first will be policy in everyday life. The second will be methodology. So what do we bring to bear in this research, and how do we study policy and practice? Third, we'll talk about what works and what doesn't work for immigrant children, given our work. So a bit about our findings, and we'll talk about some of the implications in communication and information studies, in education across disciplines, and then we'll close with some conversation about new research. We're both working on new things that build on the work we'll be sharing throughout the discussion, so we'd like to share some of that with you also. So I'll turn it over to Vikki, and she'll take a few moments to tell us more about herself and her work.
Well, thank you very much for making the time, and thank you very much to the Graduate School of Ed for the invitation to come and join you all today down the street, but we don't always make these connections, so it's fun to be here. My work focuses on immigrant families and on the communication challenges that they face as they attempt to integrate into American life. And I've looked specifically at the role of children in those families. So a project that I spent 4 years on, an ethnographic study that involved multiple methods and thankfully is finally coming out in book form in about a month with Rutgers Press, called Kids in the Middle, focuses on children of immigrants who are the primary English speakers in their households, the roles that they play as brokers of not only language and of cultural norms, but also of media and communication technologies, because children are often, in immigrant families and in others, the ones who lead the way when it comes to media and technology. And what I looked at was, for children who are the primary brokers for their families, the roles that they play in the interactions that their families have at home as they attempt to create strategies individually and collectively to understand their community, the opportunities and threats in that community, how to connect with resources and services and other people in order to reach their goals. I looked at the interactions that they have in healthcare facilities and social services and in schools. And in schools, looked at the roles that children play as intermediaries between their parents and school administrators and teachers, but also the role that children's brokering plays in their educations. So the neighborhood in South LA where I conducted this research had previously been primarily African American, and over about a 15-year period became 50% Latino and 50% African American. And for an underserved community, resources were taking their time to adapt to those sorts of changes. And so teachers often called on students to help them act as brokers in the classroom when they had new students come in who didn't speak English, to broker between the teacher and the new students. And so children played a role as brokers in the classroom. But their roles as brokers for their families were not usually recognized to their full extent by teachers and administrators. They were usually quite surprised to kind of make the link to how often children were absent, looked tired, hadn't finished their homework, and the fact that those same brokering efforts that they saw at school might also be playing out in other contexts, at home and in the community. And so I look at not just how children actively contribute to their families' attempts to incorporate into American society, but also how those family responsibilities affect children's own developmental trajectories, the chances that they make connections to schools and to educational resources and to adults who can act as important individuals in their lives when their family responsibilities require the time and effort that they do. And one of the concepts that's been an important one to me is the idea of the immigrant bargain, and that's something that perhaps we'll pick up and talk about as we have our conversation. But the immigrant bargain is a term coined by Robert Courtney Smith at CUNY, who basically says that the immigrant bargain is the idea that immigrant parents' sacrifices to have come to the United States and all the many sorts of personal and economic and social sacrifices that they make are redeemed in the achievements of their children, usually their academic and educational achievements. But those kinds of achievements are long-term goals. And what I found was that children's brokering at school, at home, in other parts of the community were often the ways that they satisfied the moral implications of that immigrant bargain in the short term. These are the things mom and dad need from me now. These are the things that I can help with now that they really need my help with, and this is how I give back. But enacting all those kinds of roles in the short term often constrained their ability to make connections within the school system that could help them make the kinds of individual long-term educational achievements that were so important, because they spent less time at school than other kids did. They had less time after school with teachers and with other resources, and as a result were less connected and felt less connected to their schools than a lot of their counterparts did. While we don't know exactly how many children of immigrants perform these kinds of roles for their parents, what we do know is that the number of children growing up in the United States with at least one immigrant parent who says that they have difficulty speaking English is on the rise. It was 49% of children of immigrants in 1990. It was 55% by 2000, 61% by 2010. And while it's 61% for children overall, for children of Central American immigrants, it's 68%, and for children of Mexican parents, it's 82%. So the chances that children of immigrants are growing up in homes where they are at least occasionally called upon to do these kinds of things for their families is very high, and is probably the norm more so than it is the exception. And yet children, as active agents of integration, have largely been left out of research on immigrant integration. It's seen as something that parents do, and their children are the beneficiaries or the dependent variable in those equations, not as active agents in what that integration looks like. So I'll stop there and turn over to
Thank you.
Ariana.
I think that's a really good segue, because one of the things that Vikki's talking about, right, is the sort of constraints and possibilities for integration in U.S. life and in U.S. Public institutions like healthcare and schools and social services. And what I focus on in my research is the role that citizenship status plays in shaping a child's trajectory in the United States. And so I think about citizenship in two ways. One way, and this draws from the work of Renato Rosaldo and Flores and Ben Mayor and Iwa Ang, is to think about cultural citizenship. And so we might, although we could talk more about this in our conversation, we might think of this conception of citizenship as more figurative, right? It's in response to state legal and juridical categories, but it's also a more emergent, from the ground up, grassroots, as it were, way of thinking about participation and belonging in a society. So the way Aiwa talks about it is that it's this dual process of being made and self-making, right? So what are the ways in which the state defines who belongs in this country and who doesn't? And then what are the ways in which communities and individuals sort of push back on those state categories through their own processes of self-making? That's an open and empirical question that I'm interested in. And then there's juridical citizenship, right? There's the legal category that the state uses and uses to define who has arrived here legally, who hasn't, and there are elaborate bureaucratic and juridical systems that surround deciding and determining not only who belongs and who doesn't, but also the sort of consequences. And in education, we have a really interesting situation where we have this Supreme Court case in 1982 called Plyler versus Doe, which started in Texas in a local school district and made it to the Supreme Court, and was really a debate about the use of public funds to support the education of the children of immigrants and of immigrant children. And the Supreme Court ruled that children, no matter where they were born, could not be denied access to a public education in this country, and that school districts needed to use public funds and tax dollars to educate all children regardless of status. What has happened as a result, now the Supreme Court didn't mandate, right, how do you protect these children and ensure that they have a public education, but sort of implicitly in implementation, the rule generally is that educators are not supposed to ask who immigrant children are, what their status is. And so in effect, in order to protect this class of children, we've rendered them invisible. Right, so we don't know who's sitting in our class is an immigrant child necessarily, or who's an undocumented child, or who's in the process of applying for legal status. And so part of what my work seeks to do is to, through ethical and longitudinal and ethnographic research, bring these children to light while still protecting them, right? And so that as educators we can think about what are our moral, educational, pedagogical, social responsibilities to these children, and as Vikki does in her work, what are the specific needs and strengths that these children have in schools, and how can we serve them? So I have conducted a longitudinal, multi-sited ethnographic study. It was a 2-year study in southwestern Pennsylvania that focused on the language, socialization, and schooling experiences of 4 children in 4 mixed status families. So families where some members were undocumented, some were U.S. born, and others were in various sort of migratory processes. I purposefully sampled families who've been in the U.S. for 5 years or less. 2 of the focal children were in high school, and 2 were in elementary school. The parents and the focal children were all undocumented, and then there were U.S. born siblings, right? So part of the question is, what are these trajectories, how are these trajectories different based upon migratory status? And the work seeks to sort of enter into the conversation about immigration and education in a number of ways, but 2 in particular I'll highlight before we open up to the conversation. One is that the national conversation around immigration and education really focuses on high school children, right? And we think a lot about, in terms of policy, the DREAM Act and access to higher education. For very good reason. It's extremely important focal point. But part of what I hope to do and seek to do in this work is to bring our focus to children in middle childhood, in elementary school, because they are also really living with and living in homes where the realities of migratory status and access and equity are relevant and are shaping their lives. So how do these children experience it? And what can we understand about educational trajectories if we start to look earlier? Right, if we don't wait till high school to think about the effects of migratory status. And the other thing I really seek to do in this work, and I know that Vikki does in hers too, is to think about the interconnections across domains, right? That what we see in the school system is not isolated from what is happening with families in terms of access to other kinds of social services and opportunities. And finally, thinking about the diversity within the family. I think that often in education we think of families as fairly homogeneous, right? And if we think about the sort of terms that Vikki was using, immigrant, language, proficiency, we tend to think of families as fairly homogeneous. If you're from an immigrant family, you're all living with immigration in a similar way, or we tend to think of home language versus school language, right? So the L1 of the family is shared by everyone. But that's actually not true, right? Children, especially these children who are brokers, have different experiences of bilingualism or multilingualism or language fluency. And in a home, we may have people who are U.S. citizens and not U.S. citizens, and so that diversity within the family is actually really important to highlight and to understand. So before talking about significance or anything else, I'll pause and we'll sort of start the exchange piece. I know we have a lot to share here. So the first thing, maybe I'll run through the 5 topics and then we'll start at the top. So we were going to talk more about policy in everyday life, methodology, what works and what doesn't work for immigrant children, implications of our work for communication and information studies, education and beyond, and then new research. So I'll sort of pose the question to Vikki. What do you see as maybe the policy regimes that are most significant in the lives of families that you study, and how do they play out in everyday life?
I mean, I think low-income families of color, immigrants, live lives that are often very policed by various forms of policy that often layer on top of each other and don't necessarily speak to each other at all. And so immigrant parents become aware very quickly that they are required by law to put their children in school. They face all kinds of difficulties related to that. They face all kinds of difficulties related to silences. And I think that one of the ways that we could talk about policy playing out in everyday life that cuts across what we both do is that you made reference to the kinds of being rendered invisible by an educational policy that says all children will be given access to American schools regardless of immigration status. But that renders invisible the people who are in those positions because you don't speak of it. And one of the ways that I saw silences playing out in this particular project and looking at children of brokers and children who broker for their families is that they didn't talk to teachers about the things that they did at home. And they wouldn't volunteer information about their families or about their responsibilities. And so one of the poignant examples of that was one of the families that I followed for a period of years. The eldest son, whose pseudonym is Luis, was the oldest of 3 boys in a family with undocumented parents, all 3 boys US born. And his middle brother was misdiagnosed as an infant, severely epileptic, had had a couple of grand mal seizures, will never be able to speak. And so this family was constantly in and out of doctors' offices and different kinds of therapies trying to help the middle son. And it was Luis who was responsible for making those connections and speaking for his parents. And there was they spent a lot of time in emergency rooms. And there was one day that and this was a common occurrence, that they'd been in an emergency room till after 2 in the morning. And so he was 11 at the time. And he went early to school the next day. He took the early bus, having stayed up obviously very late. And he went in to see his teachers and tell them that he hadn't finished his homework. And the first teacher that he said he hadn't finished his homework barely looked up from her desk and said, "You were supposed to do this at home." And he volunteered nothing else. Second teacher said, "What happened at home that you didn't finish your homework?" And it was a teacher with whom he already had a relationship, and he said, "My brother was in the emergency room, and I had to go help my mom, and we didn't get home till really, really late." The behavior on the part of that child is the same. There was incomplete homework. What the teacher attributed that to, a lack of will versus a complex family dynamic, was only made visible to the second teacher because she asked the right question and had already established a base of trust. But that's a very hard thing to do in an overcrowded classroom, in schools where the threat of violence was so high that a lot of teachers distanced themselves from their students other than basically teaching to the test. So kids didn't volunteer what they did at home to protect their parents from being judged or to protect some aspect of their lives from being touched more than it had to be. by their responsibilities to their families. They were silent about what their families would need. Children with undocumented parents were far more apprehensive about going into healthcare or social services or into schools and volunteering, anything that might mark their families as being of mixed status. And when they chose to break those silences was a very deep set of family discussions when you could trust somebody enough to let them in. But if you let them in, you run risks. But if you don't let them in, you don't get access to resources your family needs. And so I think understanding how families manage privacy, which is something that communication scholars focus on a great deal, how do families manage privacy when the secret is potentially so threatening that the opportunities and resources that might be available to you in a sanctuary city if you do break silence can be so vast. And I think that that's something that cuts through educational policy, but also larger social health and other related policies as well in terms of how people make every day constrained, but make decisions about how to manage their privacy and manage their needs.
I think your attention to homework is really interesting. One of the things I found in this study and that I continue to think about how to write about is the ways in which artifacts from the school that entered into the home prompted these conversations about citizenship and legality, and homework was a key piece. So as homework would come back and forth and families would have their afternoon routines of opening the child's book bag and taking out the homework folder and seeing what documents came in with that folder, sort of all of these questions around participation and belonging and access and citizenship came up. Yeah. And what I found was very interesting was that there were, again, these sort of figurative and juridical or literal conceptions of the citizenship that were circulating between these contexts. And so I'll also sort of give an ethnographic example. In one of the families where I conducted this 2-year study, the focal child was in 3rd grade, undocumented, had two younger U.S.-born siblings in preschool and then not yet in school. And in this particular home, not unlike other homes, one person in that home had been deported in the time of the study, right? So people were constantly coming and going across borders, and status was clearly something that had very real and material implications. And in this case, the father had been deported a few months earlier. And one afternoon, the mother received a letter in the child's book bag saying that there had been, the title of the document was Notice of Illegal Absence. The child had been absent from school quite a number of times as the mother was moving from one home to another, finding new work, dealing with the very real economic realities of losing her spouse for a period of time. And so this document comes home, Notice of Illegal Absence, which basically was calling on the mother to report to the school to address why the child had been absent so much. Now, for the school, this illegal absence meant it was not a sanctioned absence, right? It was not acceptable. The child had been absent too many times, and the repercussion was either a fine, so the parent would be fined, or the child would be retained, right? There would be some academic consequence. They'd have to repeat the year. When the document came into the home, though, without reading enough English to understand the full scope, but recognizing that the word illegal, it's the cognate, and it's significant enough that she was able to decipher it. Illegal in this space meant deportable, right? Meant actionable in terms of being told to leave the country. And so the question very quickly became, will this child, the 8-year-old, be deported for not attending school? And in my work and in Vikki's, what was significant here was the role the child was put in, right? So the 8-year-old, the document comes home, and immediately the mother asks the child to read it in English, translate it into Spanish. And so the child is a very active agent in figuring out what's the implication, and is also then sort of having to do a lot of the negotiating, not only of meaning, but of the social consequences, right? The stress, the anxiety that comes along with that. And so here what we see in terms of policy, again, is the integration and intersection between a legal system of immigration and an educational system in the school, and how those converge in the home. And so I think the next sort of question that follows here, and the next thing we wanted to talk about, and that I think would be worth sort of stepping back. We've both given these sort of ethnographic vignettes in response to this question of policy. But I think it begs the question of methodology, right? So how do we conceive of policy, track policy? I think it also begs the question, this is something we've talked about before, of what is our role in the family in terms of gaining access to this information. As you mentioned, families don't always reveal all of this to, they're very particular about who they share this information with, so why us? So maybe we can pause here and think about sort of methodology.
I think there's a few things, right? I think, I am obviously, I've studied low-income immigrant families for a long time, and primarily Mexican origin families. I am and from an immigrant family myself, but I am not Mexican, which is probably obvious to most of you. And I was fortunate to come to this country with my family, with legal, documentation, and to have had the fortunate accident of being born in an English-speaking country. I grew up in South Africa, meaning that we didn't face the kinds of language barriers that others so often do. We also had the privilege of my parents' university degrees being recognized when we moved here. But I think having grown up where I did and in the family that I did is part of why I'm drawn to the work that I am, because you couldn't grow up, at least in my family, in South Africa in the 1980s and not be wholly consumed with issues of inequality, of state-sponsored violence, of the possibilities of perseverance, of hope, and of education, and of what power there is in people taking the opportunity available to them, constrained as they may be, for self-determination, and that the dignity that is present in choice. And I think those are all the reasons why I'm interested in focusing on families that so often get denied the dignity of choice, because we presume, so often policymakers and others presume implicitly or explicitly that those who are poor will simply take what's given to them and they will be grateful for it. We will bequeath them resources and they will be grateful for it, but they make active choices like everybody else about whether or not these resources suit them, whether or not they need these things, what they'll be useful for. And children are very often denied the dignity of choice because they're presumed to simply be either adults in waiting. Children of immigrants are often presumed to be sort of warm baggage that their parents pick up and take with them. But they're not seen as active agents. And I think as someone who came out of a communication program, what I was committed to, especially as an outsider to this community and to any community that I've studied, is that I felt an overwhelming responsibility to really get the story right. And to get it from as many angles as possible to make sure that I got it right. And that meant a very sort of elaborated mixed method design and getting as many perspectives on these experiences as possible. So I worked as a graduate student for a research project called the Metamorphosis Project at USC, and through that was able to include questions in a representative random digital survey of this neighborhood, just 300 African American households, 300 Latino households, and for those parents as Spanish-speaking adults who opted to answer in Spanish, there were questions about how often a child might help them with certain tasks and so forth. So I could compare those families to other families living in the same community on all kinds of community integration indicators from a quantitative perspective. Right? Where are these families placed in terms of how comfortable they feel with certain resources, how easily they can reach certain things, what levels of neighborhood belonging they have, how do they compare to English-speaking Latinos in their areas, Spanish-speaking who don't have kids help them, African Americans, where are they situated from this kind of broader scope? I then contacted people who had said that their kids help them at least quite often with these tasks and saw if they were interested in participating in interviews. I interviewed 20 families, 22 children, because sometimes parents indicated that 2 of their children helped them a lot. Interviewed families multiple times for about 65 interviews in total. There were 4 families that I followed around for at least 4 months to every doctor's appointment, schools, social service appointments, and spent time with them in their homes. I can talk later if you're interested about why those particular families were chosen. But I followed them, and then 4 years later went back and re-interviewed them to see where they were after the conclusion of that part of the field work. And then in the institutions that we visited with them, I spent about 18 months in 2 middle schools in the area that were natural racial foils for each other. One was 25% African American, 75% Latino. The other was the opposite. And there were very different environments to go into as a Spanish-speaking parent, because one had a lot of resources and one didn't, if you didn't speak English. A local clinic, a large pediatric practice, and a local WIC center. And I spent time there, and I interviewed providers who were English-speaking but had to communicate with Spanish-speaking parents. And I was able to obviously have followed those 4 families into those interactions and observe them directly, but I also got to observe a lot of other families serendipitously having their children help them in these ways. And so as a communications scholar, for me, very important to account for every side of those interactions and what it feels like to be the kid, what it feels like to be the parent, what it feels like to be the service provider, what kinds of constraints and difficulties are observed on all those sides, how much it makes a difference when the child is not just a conduit of information, but also the object of study, right? In a parent-teacher meeting, the kid is the focus and the person giving the information. It's different when they're doing it for a sibling. If they are the focus of a doctor's appointment versus when someone else is. And so it was important to me to understand that from as many angles as possible, and it was important to me that the child be the one that I follow into those interactions and focus on, and that look at what happens around that child, not that they are simply one of those elements, but they are seen as the many different roles they play in that space. There's all kinds of moral and ethical implications, but I will happy to talk about them more, but I want to make sure that we talk about methods.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's interesting that Vikki talks about communication, because one of the sort of central questions for me is, how is a sense of citizenship communicated, right? How is that, again, beyond the legal and juridical, where we can see, do you have a passport or do you not, or from where does your passport come, and so on. In everyday life, how is that sort of sense of belonging communicated? And so I trained in a school of education, but with a focus in linguistic anthropology and language socialization. Think of communication in terms of talk, primarily. And so, you know, I draw from work in language education policy that has shifted away from the notion of policy as something that's just encoded in text to something that's lived in the world, right? So off the page and into the world. And the work of Alana Shahami and Bradley Levinson in anthropology and in language education policy are places to go for some of this thinking. And so in terms of getting the story right, as Vikki said, what I do a lot of is I record what people say. And so, you know, I do ethnographic field notes in the field, but in homes and in everyday interactions in schools, I record what people say with audio, and in the homes with video. It's been the case that in the school districts where I've worked, the video has not been permitted, but the audio has, so working with the audio in schools and video at home. And part of that is to develop a corpus, right, of language that can then be coded and analyzed in depth to understand what the patterns and themes are and how people are talking about citizenship. And one of the things has been developing my own sense of fluency as a researcher around the language and the terms that people use to make sense of this. So, you know, at first pass, in a sort of grounded theory way, I would code from what the participants were saying and develop a coding schema and then return. And one of the things I learned very quickly was that there were multiple ways of talking about citizenship. So if I coded just for citizenship, I'd get one layer. But once I learned that papeles, or papers, was a metaphorical way of talking about citizenship, right? Then I could go back and code again for papeles and find that there was a whole nother sort of layer to be uncovered in terms of what the conversation was. Or saying that someone nació de este lado o nació del otro lado, so thinking about the sides of the borders that people were born on, right, became another proxy for talking about nationality and citizenship. So all of that recording became a corpus of language that I could use to analyze the ways people were talking about it. And then as Vikki does, also thinking about not only who is talking, but who are the multiple participants, what contexts are they in, what kinds of language do they use in particular settings, and why, right? It all becomes part of this ethnographic sort of world understanding and building. One of the things that I do a lot of is use conversation analysis as a method for transcribing. So it helps to bring my attention and the reader's attention to the multiple ways that people are making sense of these terms. So if we think about lived experience, we communicate so much, not only in the literal words that we're saying, but in the tones of voice, in the prosody, the gestures that we use, the ways that we sit, and the ways that we communicate. And so all of that becomes information, right? So one of the things we talked about on the way in to campus was, how do you communicate the kinds of duress that children may be living with in a home where someone's been deported, right? So how do you communicate what that fear looks like? And sometimes it's in the quality of a cry or in the tone of voice of a parent or a child. And then on the other hand, how do you communicate, and this is something I think we both probably want to talk about as we talk about what works and implications, is how do we, at the same time as we note the structural and societal level factors that hinder opportunity, how do we also note the real strengths and resilience, right? And so where does that live, and how do you capture resilience and survival and all of that as well? So those are some methodological things I think about, some tools I use, and I think in the interest of time and wanting to open up the conversation to include your voices, maybe we should merge our sense of what works, what doesn't, and what are some implications.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think there are a number of those, and I think what I've tried very much to balance in writing the book was, on the one hand, not wanting to minimize the very real constraints that these families face, even with these very innovative strategies and things that they do to try to overcome the boundaries that might, social and otherwise, that could separate them from the native-born service providers, professionals, and other people that they encounter in the community when they're trying to access resources. You don't want to minimize those constraints and those structural difficulties, but you also don't want to harp on them so much that you miss sort of identifying and to some degree celebrating the very innovative ways that families work collectively to get around a lot of those difficulties. And what I saw here is, often the story of immigrant parents and their kids is one of intergenerational strife and conflict, right? That the American generation, this dissonant, acculturation, and they separate off from their parents, and the parents can't control them. And certainly there are times and places where that is certainly a big part of the story. But the overwhelming story here was one of cooperation and shared goals. And so to me, the implication of that, the question is, how can we harness the individual and collective skills that these families develop to address their own needs, to do that more easily, more effectively, and more broadly, right? And I think that there are a few ways to do this. And this question was a great setup, because the last chapter of the book is entirely like practical implications. If you are a provider, how could you help these families do what they do better? In schools specifically, these kids developed a set of skills helping their parents in brokering various forms of information that are so relevant to the things that they do in the classroom, but because they don't volunteer what they're doing and because teachers don't ask, they don't get connected to the classroom, right? Children who balance the family checkbook at the end of the month and help their parents write checks and understand the bills and call when someone's been overcharged, know a great deal about numbers and accounting at a very early age. Why isn't that translating more into practical applications for math that would serve not just those children, but children more generally? School nurses come in to talk to students about practical things related to their health. Why not use some of that time to talk with students, immigrants and not, about how to be a better advocate for yourself in a healthcare setting? How do you ask a doctor questions, even when you're little, about why you're sick and what you can do about it? That's not just good for children of immigrants, although it certainly serves them more immediately. That's just good practice, right? And a way to bring issues that they might be learning in their health classes, in biology classes, and so forth, into these more practical settings of how kids live outside of the classroom, but also recognizing skills they have outside of the classroom being valuable in the classroom. In healthcare settings, our healthcare system culturally, we expect that patient-provider communication, even that term, presumes a discussion between two individuals, not between a provider and a family. And that was something that when families came in together to healthcare settings, doctors were often very ill-equipped to deal with having to talk to a whole family. They didn't know how to do it. They really didn't know how to talk to children because a lot of the time their constructions of what an appropriate place was for children were violated by having to speak through children. They felt that it constrained their own professional identities to have to depend on children to do their jobs. But aside from those kinds of unexamined constructions of what's appropriate for children and what's a child's place, they didn't know how to talk to families through children. I witnessed so many interactions where they didn't stop to give the child a chance to even convey the information, that they didn't check to see if the child had understood them or ask a question. They left it to the child to ask them, what did you mean by that? Which is very difficult for a child to do, to feel like they're, allowed to ask those questions. But even more than that, providers would often speak only to the parent and ignore the child entirely, which made it even harder for the child to re-enter that interaction. Or once the child started brokering, they'd focus just on the child and not look at the parent, which made the parent feel removed from the interaction and disrespected because they weren't being treated like the person who makes final decision in the family, which they remain even if they don't speak the language. So I think that, I could talk about this for a very long time and I won't, but there are so many elements of family dynamics within these families, both the individual strategies that kids come up with and that parents support with their own examples, and the things that they do collectively by scaffolding their sets of skills to create a shared understanding, that kids bring their, skills with English, their understanding of popular culture and cultural norms, their understanding of how to use media and technology, at least better than their parents, if not quite as well as their native-born peers, to be able to access information. Parents bring to the table their much more sophisticated understandings of the world, their understandings of what the family needs, and maybe more important than anything, they bring parental authority. And these kids, even though they seem to be out in front and they're doing things independently, it is a totally interdependent act. Even when they act alone, they're acting on behalf of their families. And parental authority actually enabled their activities and was desired by these children, because it meant that there was someone standing behind them that was being brave in a way that allowed them to be brave, that modeled proactive behavior that made it easier for children to model those same behaviors in English. They learned from their parents learned from them, and that there's something very, very rich and dynamic and strong in families that are often seen as a collection of risk factors. The levels of resilience collectively and individually is something that I think has implications for service provision in diverse communities in a very large number of ways.
I think your opening example is really an important one for us here in the GSE and broadly for thinking about education in terms of curriculum and the kinds of understandings that immigrant children bring to the classroom. One of the things I think about in terms of implications is we have, the Common Core standards, for example, right, that are of increasing importance nationally and are guiding the ways we think about learning and teaching in schools. And one of the core kinds of texts that children are working with and thinking about 21st century literacy and global literacy and those concepts is text like expository writing, right? So being able to make meaning from text and understand information that's being communicated and significance. And one of the things I've observed of children, undocumented and children of immigrants, is they have an incredible, lots of experience, frankly, thinking about the significance of text, right? The other day I was in a science classroom and the teacher brought up the question of, they were studying landforms, and she brought up the question of the border and asked children to weigh in on what borders meant for them. And I heard, not on the level of the whole group discussion, but in smaller group conversations, children talking about Obama's proposed immigration policy and why hasn't it gone further, and what is his position, and that there are people who disagree with the policy, and so they were thinking about things like the purpose of particular texts, of the author's point of view, of stance, of perspective taking, things that they are all doing as they're interpreting in the home, listening to the news, talking with family members. And so we have the sort of enduring concept of cultural relevance in public education, thinking about culturally relevant curriculum. But I think that part of what our work can do is help to think about what is actually culturally relevant in these particular classrooms and in these homes, and how can that then be leveraged for academic purposes. And I think we're both indebted to research like Marjorie Orellana, and there are others, Garcia Sanchez at Temple, people who are thinking about how immigrant children's skills and resources can be leveraged for academic learning. And so that's something else we could talk about. I think also we think in education about cultural relevance, and one of our sort of enduring concepts is this idea of funds of knowledge, and thinking about what immigrant families bring and what parents bring to their children's learning, and how they can help in terms of the knowledge they bring from their home country. Yeah. And I think that funds of knowledge is often thought of as a set of activities, right? So parents maybe were farmers in Mexico. This is a common example, right? And so as a result of that, they bring certain understandings about agriculture and land and economy. And I think that's true. I think what we also show, though, is that funds of knowledge is not only a discrete set of activities that's shaped from the home country, but is something that's ongoingly negotiated and growing, and is shaped by structural factors as well, right? So understandings about systems and societies and politics and so on. One of the things that I am hoping to continue to do in this work, and that I think we both bring, is this ability to have conversations with teachers about the paradox that we have been talking about throughout, the visibility and visibility piece. And I'll close by saying, or sort of returning full circle, Vikki started talking about statistics, right? The growing population of children growing up in homes where parents report not speaking English as a first language, right? I think one of the things that I always like to bring to this conversation for teachers is, even though the national conversation around immigration tends to focus on policing the border, right? And you started talking about surveillance. The fact is that families are not really coming and going. There's not as much border crossing happening in this decade as there was 2 decades ago, even though we continue to sort of focus on that question of, are they crossing a border? The fact is that the rate of growth of the Latino, but primarily the Mexican population in this country, is fertility, right? It's parents who are here, who crossed by number of means, who are having children who are U.S.-born citizens, right? But who are growing up in homes where questions of immigration are still very present. So I think we would do well, and we would serve the children well, by shifting the focus from border crossing and policing and concerns about that to a question and a sort of focus on who are the children who are actually here and who are growing up here but are still growing up in homes where there's cultural difference and differential access to opportunity.
And I would play on what you're saying about borders and say that the question is less so about a national border than it is about social boundaries, right? And who gets to cross which boundaries and have access to certain resources is really the bigger question. And what are the mechanisms available to leverage access that could be used more effectively for these families, right? Which I think is something we're both trying to build on in the work we're working on now.
Yes,
right.
That's which I know that we would both love to talk more about. But we have about 5 or 7 minutes for questions, so maybe we should pause. And if the question comes up about what's at work, it would be great.
That's great.
But thank you all for listening. We'd love to invite your questions, comments, voices in the conversation.
You mentioned in the beginning that the immigrant children who are helping their parents, for example, balance the checkbook and make out and are involved in family finances, that we're finding, and I guess we can sort of all observe that it's not translating into success in mathematics at school. And I wondered if any of your research, your personal research or any research of people that you know, is trying to figure out why it is?
I think that there are all kinds of efforts that are ongoing to try to make those linkages between what's being done at home and what's being done at school more transparent and more obvious, and link those things in ways that are more obvious and that lead to the kind of social closure that we see in more middle-class homes, right? Or what, for those of us who do work related to media and technology, refer to as connected learning, right? So that what you do in school, what you do at home, what you do in different social spaces, that all of those forms of learning can be linked. For kids who have more connected learning, those are kids who engage in the kind of learning that leads to deep mastery of material. And so while I can't think of anyone who's looking specifically at the question of why Mexican origin, families may be engaging in certain practical math practices at home and they may not be translating into the classroom, at least in my own work, two things. One is that for the kids that I spent time with, and in the two classrooms, mixed classrooms that I observed over the course of a year, one in each middle school, children of Mexican immigrants tended to rate math as their strongest subject and the one that they enjoyed the most. And for a lot of parents, it was the only subject they could continue to help with, because I don't have to tell the people in this room that the math education in Mexico tends to be more advanced than here. So a parent who's gone to 5th grade or the equivalent in Mexico might be able to help with 7th grade math in the U.S. I also had a large number of families that were teaching kids how to do things like long division out of math textbooks they'd brought with them from Mexico. And so while the teachers were initially mystified as to why kids were getting the right answer using methods they'd never seen, once it got explained to them, a lot of them allowed any format of working out the problem as long as the answer was right, as a way to kind of show some deference to and encouragement to parents to keep doing this. And my joke, as I heard for like the 6th time, that someone was learning math out of a math textbook that their dad had brought with him as he walked from southern Mexico to Los Angeles. I remember looking at one of the mothers and saying to her, my family comes from Eastern Europe, we're Jewish, and we are always supposed to, celebrate it as the love of education that the Jews have, right? The high rates of achievement. My grandfather didn't leave Lithuania with his math textbook, but these parents did. And while it's a small, story and an example, it speaks, I think, it's a testament to the fact that, there's more strength in these families in terms of educational resources than is often seen. And I think that something that I'm working on now, where we're trying to create conditions for connected learning that are more meaningful for Mexican origin families, is the question of how technology can be leveraged in that process in a way that's meaningful to these families. And so, I won't talk about it at length, but I've got new funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to look at how Mexican origin families with children on free lunch in 3 communities in the Southwest are making decisions about adopting broadband when it's offered to them through digital equity initiatives, adopting technologies related to that, and then what kinds of learning practices are happening at home, either connected to school or to informal learning, and then what we can take from what people are actually doing and the decisions they are actually making to designing programs that actually serve the needs that people themselves say they have, rather than presuming that we understand what they need in order to connect with schools and to other forms of learning that are not as formalized. So hope to be able to answer that question in more detail soon. Other questions or comments?
What are your thoughts about how one might go about mitigating the situation you brought up toward the beginning of your lecture, where there's a policy to sort of hide the non-citizen status, or basically to hide this information about, who is here legally, who is not, from the people in the schools, administrators and teachers, with the need to, like on one hand, the policy is there to sort of protect people, to not let information be misused against them, but at the same time, it is not enabling the information to be used in a supportive way. And so, that seems to be, something. So looking at this at a broader policy issue, what thoughts do you have as informed by your work about what might we do about that?
Yeah, I think it's a real double bind, right, for sure, and a sort of very living paradox in the schools and on a policy level. I think that it speaks to one of the real potential roles for researchers and people in schools of education, right? I think we are schools across the university, I think we're in a unique position to bring to light a lot of this sort of ethnographic, qualitative, and larger scale evidence of what these children and families are experiencing in a way that still protects their anonymity, right? So a lot of what, some of what I've been doing with this initial study has been holding workshops for educators, some here at the GSE, some beyond, where I can bring that ethnographic data to light to then talk about the paradox without revealing the status of particular children and families. And in the work that I'm currently doing, I'm also on research leave. I have funding from the Spencer Foundation to do a year-long ethnography of another round of mixed status families in New York City, and I'm working in a particular school. So I'm in school classrooms there and tracking the experiences of fifth grade girls as they go from fifth grade to middle school, undocumented young girls in that educational transition. One of the things that I think is a real potential is to be working in a school site to then do professional development locally with those teachers and theoretically then on a school district level in New York City. So I like to think that that's, optimistically speaking, a potential impact that researchers and ethnographers and educators can make. I think on a policy level, things like the DREAM Act, which has been sort of or DACA actually, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, right, which has been the closest sort of that we've gotten on a federal level to have some policy or some pathway to integration, even though it's not full citizenship for immigrant youth and undocumented youth. One of the things that I think has been interesting about that is that young people have been applying for it, right? So that it is another sort of indication could give some hope that even people who are very fearful of revealing their status, when presented with an opportunity to become integrated and have more access to legal rights, will pursue them, right? So there's a colleague of ours at Harvard University, Roberto Gonzalez, who's doing some research now to really see what the impact of DACA has been, how many people are accessing it, what's the implication, and his work would be important to follow. But I think what the indication is that we may assume falsely that people, that families are in such a state of fear that they won't seek out opportunities when they're made available. And while I think that our work shows that families are very thoughtful about when they reveal their status, they're also so committed to finding opportunities for themselves and their children that they would take the risk, right, of filing an application, of seeking support. So I think what that indicates, in short, is that we as educators should prepare ourselves to have the conversations, and I think that if we invite families to do so and to think about how we can support them in accessing resources, they will be open to talking with us about it. And I think we can find ways to collaborate. And that's just thinking out loud in response to your question, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Something for us to consider, in terms of next steps. So I think we have to close here, if that's all right, but we would love to continue the conversation, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming. Thanks very much.